We are very grateful to have you here. He's a very well-known economist. He was formerly Minister of Planning in Venezuela. He was the first chief economist of the Inter-American Development Bank, and since the year 2000, he is professor of the practice of international political economy at Harvard Kennedy School in the United States. He says that a punitive tax on Russian oil could be much better than an embargo, and that's also what he's going to say in his keynote. Dear Professor Ricardo Hausmann, we are looking forward to your keynote speech. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you, and congratulations on your fantastic Spanish. Let me start by saying that I'm fully aware of the difficult situation in which the world economy and the European economy is right now, given energy shortages and high prices. But this is also happening in the context of a war in the Ukraine, and the need to impose some kind of sanctions, some kind of constraint, so that Russia will not be able to project power the way it is, and it will constrain their ability to project power. I think that the crisis has shown the problems with the EU's dependency and Germany's dependency on Russian oil, and there's a great desire and demand to reduce that dependency in the long run. And the question is how best to do it. And so I guess the discussion has to somehow involve the management of the current situation on the energy front, the need to do something about Russia in the Ukraine, and the need medium term to develop some greater autonomy vis-a-vis Russia on the energy front in the medium term. So I understand these to be the issues. So in this context, I would like to talk a little bit about sanctions on Russia. There's been different kinds of sanctions, and here, the sanctions are more impactful the bigger the coalition that imposes the sanctions. So if it were a coalition of the EU, the US, and G7 partners, it would be more meaningful than if it was just unilaterally by the EU, the US, or any of the parties. So that's the first comment on sanctions. The sanctions that have been attempted today have been some that have to do with limiting the capacity of Russia to spend money to acquire things, and that was done by freezing their financial assets and by banning some key exports to Russia, for example, oil production equipment, airplane parts, microprocessors, etc. So that's a kind of sanction that limits the capacity of Russia to acquire. Another kind of sanction is those that limit the capacity of Russia to make money, to earn money, and those have to do with somehow limiting their ability to export. And in that context, you have the need to discuss either an embargo or something else. Now, how do oil sanctions work? The answer to this question is that it depends on some key factors. The first factor is how transportable or how processable is the oil we're talking about. How common, typical, easy to move is that oil? How large is the coalition that imposes the sanction? Is it global? Is it partial? How many players? And what kind of a sanction it is? And here I'm going to consider whether it's an embargo or some kind of a tax. And here I would like to make the ideas clear by just using what Albert Einstein used to call a Gedanken experiment. And these Gedanken experiments help us fix ideas. So imagine that we lived in a world, not our world, but a different world in which it was completely costless to transport oil, and it was irrelevant where it would be processed, okay? So in that world, let's assume that the West, the EU, the US, G7, and so on, impose a sanction on Russia, what would happen? Well, if they impose an embargo, well, what would happen is, since it's costless to move oil around, Russia would sell all of its oil to China. And in the process of doing that, it would sort of kick out the current suppliers of China in the Gulf. And so the Gulf would redirect its oil to Europe. And in that context, an embargo would have zero impact on prices or volumes. It would not hurt Russia, and it would not hurt the West. If instead, in that world, you imposed a tax, well, that tax would be also costless and ineffective. Russia would avoid the tax by just sending the oil to China, and the Gulf would redirect its oil to Europe. Nobody pays the tax, nobody receives the tax. It essentially has no impact. What we learn from this experiment is that the impact of sanctions on the oil market depends critically on how flexible is supply and demand in that market. Now, let's take the opposite extreme of this perfectly movable example I just gave. Let's take natural gas. Natural gas is very, very hard to redirect. At the present, for Russia, it's essentially impossible to redirect. Its production of liquefied natural gas is at capacity. The pipeline that flows to China is at capacity, and the other pipelines move west. So that under these conditions, there's very little that Russia can do to sell elsewhere. At the same time, since Russian gas is not sufficient to supply all of Europe's needs, then Europe needs to bring more expensive LNG from the Gulf or from the US and regasify it. And so the gas price reflects the marginal cost of bringing additional gas from those sources. And because those costs are significantly higher than the cost that Russia gets from pumping gas and sending it through the pipelines, Russia earns a significant rent on those natural gas. Russia is producing more or less the same amount of gas it was producing when the price was a half or a third of where it is now. So this indicates that that difference is really not an increase in their costs. It's an increase in the marginal cost of supplying gas to Europe, which benefits them. And here it's interesting to note that while the price of 1 million BTUs of natural gas in Europe is over $60, probably $80 these days, the natural gas in the US right now is at $5. So it shows how difficult it is to move gas from one place to the other. How is natural gas now then different from the Gedanken experiment I started with, where everything was completely ineffective? Well, in this world of natural gas, an embargo would force Russia to cut production, probably in a very costly way, because these oil fields and gas fields are not meant to be shut down and up. They are ideally producing at the rate at which they were designed. So they would have to cut down production. Because they would cut production, global supplies would come down, prices would go up. Russia would suffer because it doesn't sell natural gas, but Europe would suffer because they don't get natural gas. They would have to buy more from other LNG producers at a higher price, and the West would get hurt. In this context, a tax would have a radically different impact. If the tax makes it such that after tax, Russia is still better off selling than not selling, then Russia will maintain its supply because its options are not many. It will have to maintain the supply of natural gas. The after-tax price will equal the cost of bringing natural gas from wherever else. the supply of natural gas to Europe would not change, prices would not change, and Russia would have to pay all of the tax out of its own pocket. Other producers do not gain. Europe gains, Russia loses. So in that world, in the context of natural gas, the optimal a tax works remarkably better than an embargo. A tax makes Europe richer. An embargo makes Europe poorer. A tax does not benefit other producers. An embargo would benefit other producers. Now, things are different with oil. Oil is easier to transport than natural gas, but not necessarily costlessly. Moreover, oil is not homogeneous. There are different kinds of oil, and as we all know, Russian oil is both heavy and sour. Sour means that it has a lot of sulfur in it. And because of that, it is best refined in deep conversion refineries that happen to be located mainly in Germany, some in Austria, and in the United States. So those are the ideal places to refine Russian gas, because if you put this heavy oil in a normal refinery, it produces a lot of heavy products that are much less valuable. If you put it in a deep conversion refinery, it generates much more light crudes. Those refineries are more costly, but they also buy a cheaper oil. In addition, transportation capacity is, some combination of pipelines and shipping. The places where Russia has additional shipping capacity, if they were, for example, to decide not to sell oil to Europe and sell it to, say, to China, they would have to go through either Baltic ports or Black Sea ports. And those are very far from China. They're farther from China than the Gulf is to Europe. So they would have additional shipping costs, and these shipping costs, these ships would have to be insured, and these insurance companies are sanctioned or can be sanctioned, have been sanctioned. So it's not that easy for Russia to move that oil around. And as a consequence, Russian oil that was selling at a discount of $2 to $4 vis-a-vis Brent is currently selling at over $30 vis-a-vis Brent. That shows that it's not that easy to move that oil around. So how is Russian oil different from our Gedanken experiment? Well, Russian oil, if we impose an embargo on it, Russia would have to try to send it to China. It would have to sell it at a discount, but that discount would be bigger than the discount than the additional price that Europe would have to pay to ship the oil, not from Russia, but from the Gulf. So in that scenario, an embargo would cause prices to rise in Europe and Russia to suffer, mainly by these differences in the efficiency of refining and transportation costs. In this context, the tax would also be superior, because instead of having Russia pay the cost of sending the stuff to China, you could fix a tax so that it would be still better off, Russia would still be better off sending it to the West and not having to discount the oil so much. They would have to pay the tax. And the tax would have to be, they will have to absorb the tax, because the marginal cost of supplying oil to the West, to Europe, would still be bringing it from the Gulf, and that has no tax. So a tax in this context also would work more effectively than an embargo. So the implications of all that is that a tax is less costly than an embargo. In some sense, an embargo is an infinite tax, and the ideal tax, the optimal tax, is not infinity. It's something different. So if the tax is not too high, it will be paid exclusively by Russia. Prices to consumers would not change, but the tax revenue would be accrued by the parties that impose the sanction. So it would make the West richer relative to the alternative. Now, if you put the tax even higher, it may reduce supply and raise prices, but this cost of increased prices would be compensated in a large margin by the fact that the government would be collecting the tax. Now, this analysis also shows that the optimal tax on natural gas should be much higher than the optimal tax on oil, so that you would start by imposing a significant tax on gas. So those are my comments regarding how to, whether how to use, if you were to use a sanction on Russian energy, what would be the best instruments to do it. Now I want to change the conversation and think about the medium term. What we have found out is that having the world relied on Russian oil represents a strategic vulnerability for Europe. And that's something that we must understand. But and everybody understands. But in a globally integrated oil market, the fact that you stop buying oil from Russia does not buy that much more protection, because if Russia decides to embargo the world, oil prices go up, and they would also go up in Europe. This is what happened in 1973 when the Arab countries wanted to embargo some countries and not others, but the effect was all the same, that everybody's oil price went up. So there is just so much that you gain from reducing your own purchases from Russia. What you really want to do is to reduce the world's purchases from Russia and to have Russia reduce its market share. And this can be done by financial sanctions that prevent Russia from raising the capital to expand or to maintain oil production, and by sanctioning its technology, its access to oil drilling technology and oil-related technologies more generally, and by restricting their access to markets. And that would make investments in oil production in Russia less attractive, and it would shrink the capacity of Russia to export oil. This can be made compatible in a decarbonizing world, because in a decarbonizing world, somebody has to reduce oil production. The atmosphere doesn't really care too much about where that oil those emissions are reduced, because we all share the atmosphere. But it would be very good to, in the process of decarbonizing, to reduce oil production in places that are threatening to the rest of the world, in places where there are bad actors, where oil income can become a source of strategic threat to the rest of the world. And in that sense, I think that we need to rethink what is the whole, in OPEC, we need to rethink what is its whole strategy. OPEC allowed Russia to expand massively production. Oil production in Russia in 1996 was 6 million barrels. Oil production in Russia before this war was 11 million barrels, 11 and a bit million barrels. So they went up, they almost doubled production. They increased production by 5.3 million barrels between 1996 and 2016, when they joined OPEC. and created OPEC Plus. So in some sense, OPEC allowed Russia to double production and then sort of like invited them in. In that context, Saudi increased production very little. They were producing 9 million barrels of oil in 1996, and they only increased to 12 million. And after 2016, when Russia joined, in order to maintain prices, they cut production, something that Russia didn't do. So the strategy to include Russia in OPEC Plus hasn't really worked for OPEC. OPEC would be better off if the world helped reduce Russian production, so that production cuts and so on would have to be borne by Russia, and they would stand to benefit from the cuts being done in Russia. So there is a world in which we encourage OPEC to break with Russia and to benefit from the sanctions and the restrictions on Russia. Here, there's an important role that the US could also play in making sure that the world, that oil production doesn't happen in countries that endanger the world. As we all know, decarbonization policies have constrained production in the West. ESG has forced the oil majors to divest from fossil fuels. The US did not license the Keystone pipeline that would have brought oil from Canada to the US. The US had restricted exploration in federal lands. So all of this was in a policy of trying to reduce global emissions by reducing US production. But the US in principle has ample capacity to ramp up production of oil and LNG, and that would be compatible with a world that is decarbonizing if this was done to compensate for the reduction in Russian production. Now, it would be ideal also that the extra production that the world would need to compensate for Russia's contraction it come from the US, because in the US shale oil, you drill a hole and oil comes out for at most 2 years, and 70-80% of the oil comes out in the first year. So it's not like traditional oil where you drill a well and you're expecting oil coming out of that well for a decade or so. So if we don't want to be producing too much oil in the next decade, it would be good that the expansion of capacity be done in places where that production is shorter lived. So in this sense, the U.S. could play a significant role if it lifted temporarily its restrictions on oil production in order to compensate for the reduction in Russian production that we all would like to achieve. So decarbonization would take place through a cut in Russian output. So in synthesis, what I wanted to say is that to sanction Russia in the short run, a tax is less costly than an embargo and could even be beneficial relative to no action. It will be particularly effective and large for natural gas, but it could also be significant for oil, but much larger for natural gas. For the long run, it is not enough to stop buying from Russia. It is necessary that Russia becomes a less significant player in energy markets in general. And this can be achieved through sanctions on inputs, on finance, and on market access. And to make it compatible with market stability and decarbonization, it could emerge from an agreement between consuming countries and non-Russian producers in both OPEC and the US. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ricardo Hausmann. You said a tax is better than an embargo, but on the political level, we usually talk about an embargo. That's it. We talk about that. So actually, I would like to know how realistic is your idea of the tax instead of an embargo?
I mean, there's a reason why you want to ask economists, because an embargo sounds more morally sure, more punishing, etc. But the world is a little bit complicated, and you want to harm Russia's capacity to project power at a minimum cost to you. If you impose a sanction that is too costly to you, you will lose the political capacity to sustain that sanction. And you may not harm. I mean, it could be that you may do more harm to yourself than to Russia. So I think that the issue of the tax is being discussed. There's a very nice paper by Daniel Gross, not only making a similar point, but also coming up with an estimate of how much to tax gas, and you think that a tax would be something like 2/3 of the price of natural gas. It's better to do that than what I understand Germany is discussing or has just done, which is to reduce the tax on gasoline. The reduction in the tax of gasoline will increase the price of oil and would benefit Russia. It will eventually not accrue to the consumer, because the price of gasoline is not going to stay constant. So I know it's counterintuitive that why would you, what Germany has agreed is to do exactly the opposite of what I have just proposed. But I think that it's just a policy mistake.
3 months, huh? The tax reduction on gasoline is only for 3 months so far.
Yes, but maybe in those 3 months, the price of oil will go up to compensate. So it's not the right instrument. If you had imposed a tax and given a rebate to consumers, then the consumers might be better off. The tax would have been paid by Russia and would have been received by the consumer.
Or is it maybe just too difficult for the international community to agree on a global punitive tax on Russian gas imports? Is that the case? Is it too difficult to agree?
I think that right now there is an agreement in Canada, the US, to impose some kind of sanction. It is Europe that is concerned about its energy stability, and for good reason, given the structure of the markets. But I would argue that there is a viable coalition of G7 plus EU, and even you can add there South Korea and Singapore and Turkey, that have other options. They don't need to buy Russian oil, and they are more flexible in terms of their supplies. And as a consequence, I think they are likely to join. But they would have to join in something that looks efficient. And I think an embargo just does not look efficient.
Mm-hmm. Maybe last question at this point. Putin just announced that he wants unfriendly countries to pay for Russian gas in rubles. What effects do you expect?
Well, in order to pay in rubles, people would have to take their euros and dollars and exchange them for rubles at the market. So it would increase the supply of dollars to Russia. So instead of paying in dollars, so that Putin would get his dollars, he will get his dollars anyway, would avoid the sanctions and would get his dollars anyway by forcing companies to convert their dollars into rubles in the local Russian market. So I think it is a smart move on his end, because it would de facto increase the availability of dollars in Russia. He has done also a very smart thing too. He has if you want, imposed an embargo on Kazakh oil. So because he has shut down the pipeline that sends 80% of Kazakh oil, and that way he causes the price of oil to go up, but his sales don't go down. Only Kazakh sales go down. So that was also a very smart move on his side. That's one more reason why you want to tax his oil.
Okay, well, we say thank you very much, Ricardo Hausmann, for your time, for sharing your ideas here with us. I think it was a perfect conclusion of our Congress today. Thanks very much for being here. Take care.
Thank you.
And that's your applause.